I'm Chris Busby. I'm the Scientific Secretary of the European Committee on Radiation Risk, and I'm a visiting professor at the University of Ulster in Northern Ireland. And I'm an expert on the health effects of low doses of radiation, in particular on the health effects of uranium from weapons use.
I am Sigyn Meder, board member of Iraksolidaritet Association in Stockholm. And we are very concerned about the children of Falluja, and we want to welcome you, Dr. Busby, to talk about them. But it could also just as well be about Basra, Baghdad, Najaf, or the many places around Iraq where children are born with extreme high rates of birth defects and where cancer rate has developed explosively. For many of us, Falluja is a symbol of the US destruction of Iraq, but also of popular resistance against the occupation. Today, the suffering children of Falluja are proof of the human disaster that has taken place all over Iraq, proof of the long-term effects of this crime.
Well, I'll start with the most important conclusion of all of the studies, so that we have a heading for what we're going to ultimately find. And that is that there seems to be some weapon being used, which is a secret weapon, and this weapon either produces or uses slightly enriched uranium. And this is the most important conclusion of all of the three studies that we have done. And the type of weapon and the type of uranium that has been produced as a result of this weapon's use causes enormously high levels of congenital malformation and also enormously high levels of cancer. And when I say enormously high, I mean just that. I've done a number of epidemiological studies, and I've done a lot of research in the area of epidemiology, and I have to say, without any shadow of a doubt, the levels of cancer and leukemia that we have found, and the levels of congenital disease that we have found, are astronomically high. They're higher than anything that has ever been published in the whole history of epidemiology. Even after Hiroshima, they didn't find levels of cancer as high as the levels that we have found in Falluja. And the levels of congenital malformation also are very, very high. So whatever it is that's being used, it's got to be something that is capable of producing this kind of genetic damage. So let me tell you about the studies.
Yeah.
There were 3 studies. 2 of them have been published now in the peer-reviewed literature, and one of them it has been submitted. It's really quite hard to get these sorts of politically spun studies published in Science, because there are lots of people who are trying to keep them out. But we have managed to publish 2 of them. So they are in the peer review literature. What we did, first of all, in order to follow up the many stories, anecdotal evidence and so forth, of increases in cancer and congenital malformation in Iraq, we decided to look for one part of Iraq that was clearly more contaminated than any of the others. Because in epidemiology, what you have to start with is you have to start with a population that you know has been contaminated, or is the most suspect population. So many people were saying that the levels of congenital disease and the levels of cancer in Falluja were enormously high. So we decided to go and look. And we visited, my colleagues in Iraq, recruited a team of people to go and visit houses and knock on the door and apply a questionnaire. And this questionnaire asked who lived there, how old they were, what sex they were, and how many cancers and of what type of cancer had been diagnosed in the last 5 years, and with the date and the person's age and everything. So all of the details we got on this questionnaire. And this resulted in quite a large number of people. About 4,800 people responded, and that enabled us to have sufficient statistical power to say what the cancer rates were, and we also looked at infant mortality, and we looked at the sex ratio. The sex ratio is the number of boys born to the number of girls, which is normally 1,050 boys to 1,000 girls in all human populations. And what we found was that the levels of cancer were, as I said, extremely high. For example, for leukemia in the age group 0 to 35, we found 20 cases, which represents a relative risk of 38 times the expected number. You can work out the expected number on the basis of the age of the population, and you apply the rates from a control population, which hasn't been exposed. And we used, and since we thought that Iraq was probably mostly exposed, we had to use another Arab country. So we used two countries. We used Egypt, which has got a reasonable cancer registry, and we used Jordan as well. And on the basis of both of those predictions, assuming that the population, the control population was Egypt, we had a 38-fold excess of leukemia, and there was a 10-fold excess of breast cancer, and there was a 14-fold excess of childhood cancer, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Now, normally in populations that are exposed, for instance, to nuclear releases from power stations or Chernobyl or something, you might expect to get 2 times or 3 times, at absolute maximum 4 or 5 times. To get 38 times is just unheard of. After Hiroshima, they were getting 17 times the increase in leukemia, and that was in the whole population. So we've got something very serious there. And also we have that the sex ratio is altered, so that the number of boys born now, instead of being 1,050 to 1,000 girls, we now have 860 boys to 1,000 girls. And the interesting thing is we can also look at the populations that were born before 2004, because we have the age groups for 5-year age groups, 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14. We know how many boys and girls there are in each of those age groups. And before 2004, there was no problem with the population sex ratio. It was normal, roughly normal. So whatever it was, and this is important, this is why the sex ratio is important, that whatever it was, it happened in 2004. So if something happened in 2004 which caused an increase in cancer, an increase in congenital malformation, that was the first study. So then the second study was to go and look and see what it was. And what we did was we took hair samples from the parents of children with congenital malformations, because you can analyze metals in hair. And of course everyone said depleted uranium, so we were basically looking for uranium. And so we took about 50 hair samples, and we had them measured in Germany using a technique called inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, which is quite a modern, sophisticated technique. And it's capable of measuring uranium and other elements to a very high degree of accuracy. And what we found was that the levels of quite a few elements were high, so calcium and magnesium and aluminium, sort of materials you would find in destroyed masonry or so on, were much higher than they should be on the basis of control values that we got from Sweden. Because a number of populations have had their hair sampled around the globe, and you can get an average level of what you might expect from all these studies that have been done before. We didn't use controls from Iraq, and the reason is because we weren't sure that they wouldn't also be contaminated, and so it would have been quite a valuable waste of time, because these things cost a lot of money. We have to pay a lot of money for these analyses, even though we didn't pay as much as we should, because I used my charm on the people who were doing the studies. And of course they like to do, you know, scientists, or honourable scientists, like to do good things. That's where they start out from, you know. And a lot of the stuff they do is just worthless analysis of dog food and stuff like this, you know. So when you give them a project which has potentially the possibility of finding something very useful and important, they'll usually do it, very often for nothing.
Yes.
So anyway, we did that, and we found, as I said, these masonry and rubble increases. We found slightly high levels of found high levels of mercury and strontium also, but none of those things are capable of causing congenital malformations or cancer. We know this from the literature.
Okay.
So the only thing we did find that could back up the cancer and the congenital disease was uranium. So we did find uranium. We were looking for uranium, we found uranium. And the levels of uranium were about 3 times higher than controls in Israel, and about 6 times higher than controls from Sweden. So the normal Swedish population concentration of uranium in hair is 1/6 of the population concentration in Falluja, in the mothers of these children with congenital disease. And then we did something quite clever, which was to look along the length of the hair, because the way in which material in the body is excreted is through the urine, but it also excreted into the hair. And so the hair grows at a particular rate. It grows at about 1 centimetre every month. And we had some women with very long hair, because these are Muslims and they don't tend to cut their hair. So we had one woman whose hair was 80 centimetres long. Oh. So that took us 80 months back into the past, when we looked at the end of her hair. And so what we were able to show was that the concentration of uranium in the hair went up as time went backwards. So it wasn't steady, it wasn't uniform, so it wasn't something to do with the environment, it was something that was very high in the past and was getting lower. So that is also very important. And in fact, the levels in the hair in this woman, this 80 centimetre hair woman, which took us back to 2005, were probably about 10 times higher. So instead of 6 times higher than Sweden, they're now 60 times higher than Sweden. So we have found a lot of uranium in the hair, and it also goes up as you go back in time. But then the most interesting thing about it was that when we looked at the isotopic ratio, we found that it was slightly enriched, that it wasn't depleted uranium. Everybody's expecting depleted uranium. There wasn't depleted uranium. We also looked at soil samples, and we looked at water samples from the Euphrates, from tap water, and from wells, 2 wells that were there. We were limited. I'd have liked to have looked at a lot more, but we're limited for money, you see, because each sample you send costs you another 130 euros, you know. So we found small amounts of enriched uranium in the soil, but not very high amounts. So all of these things taken together point to the existence of a weapon that was used in the Battle of Falluja, which was some kind of anti-personnel weapon and a new weapon, and they either produced enriched uranium or used slightly enriched uranium. And so this is the cause, we feel, of these increases in congenital malformation. Now the point is that some people have said, oh well, you don't really know that there is an increase in congenital malformation, because our original paper only looked at cancer and infant mortality, and although the infant mortality was high, of course you can die as a baby from all sorts of diseases. It doesn't have to be a congenital disease. So the third study, which hasn't been published yet, which was rejected by the Lancet and a few other journals, what that did was it followed one paediatric clinic in Falluja General Hospital, and we asked the doctor there, who's one of my collaborators, to write down each one of the congenital malformations that she had to deal with in the hospital, and also write down the number of births that this came from. And so this way we could find out the specific types of congenital malformation. It wasn't just like congenital malformation. We could say heart defects, or neural tube defects, or kidney defects, or childhood cancer, or various types, classes. And on the basis of that, we were able to compare it with control populations, and it was quite clear that the levels were between 4 times and 10 times what we would have expected, even allowing for consanguinity. So we allowed for that, we controlled for using Pakistan and other Arab countries where they marry their cousins. If you marry your cousin, you're going to get inbreeding genetic malformations because of the expression of these normally silent genes, these recessive genes. And so we controlled for that. So even given that, we had up to 8 to 10 times the levels of congenital malformation. So as far as I'm concerned, we have actually nailed the entire thing. We have proved that there is a level of genetic damage, genomic damage. We've proved that all the people who are talking about increases in cancer and congenital malformation are all right. Yes. And we have shown that the cause almost certainly is enriched uranium. Of course, we cannot rule out the possibility that there's something we haven't thought about. There might have been some kind of chemical, perhaps, that was used, and that was extremely powerful genotoxic chemical. But actually, I don't think that is possible. And the reason I don't think it's possible is...
If I might put in a short question. They have been burning pits in, the burning outside the bases, lots of waste of very poisonous contents that could maybe also create some illnesses among the children and other people.
Well, this would have to be, I think...
research must be.
I think that the question of other causes is something that we could go into. But my point was this: that all of these pieces of evidence point to 2004. So the question is, why is it that we still have these high levels of congenital malformation? Now, all chemical mutagens that I know about are substances which occur and produce an effect, and then they're gone. You know, but this, whatever it is that's producing this, isn't gone. It's still there.
No, it's still there.
And the levels of congenital malformation still are very high. And so are the levels of cancer. So, I mean, the cancer you can explain, but not the congenital malformation. So something is causing that still.
Yeah.
And that's hard to explain on the basis of chemicals.
Yeah. But you said that something must have happened in Falluja in 2004. And we know that that was the year when the US made 2 big attacks on Falluja and destroyed a big part of the city. I just want also to ask, because as there is some debate about the validity of your findings, is it something that you would like to add to these people who think that there are problems with your research?
Well, partly because it is that I have been so successful in my research to show that this ionizing radiation from internal nuclides is dangerous, I have been the subject increasingly of attacks from individuals on the internet, and attacks, people writing to my university, writing to the journals, and in fact a number of my papers, or our papers, have been blocked as a result of threats or letters being written to the journals. And I think the reason for this is that they don't want me to produce... I mean, if you think about it, if there is such a weapon, and we found evidence of a similar weapon being used in the Lebanon in 2006, if there is such a weapon, they would move heaven and earth to stop any paper being published that would show the existence of this. They would put people in high places in the anti-nuclear movement, in the green movement, all over, and we know that these people exist. In the DU movement, the International Coalition to Ban Depleted Uranium Weapons focuses, for example, on depleted uranium weapons, and they will never concede that there is a new generation of uranium weapons, and they will not cite any of my research that shows this. And yet the extraordinary thing is that my research is published in the peer review literature. Whereas these people who are attacking me, they attack on the internet, and they write letters to my funders, to my supporters, they cut off my funding, they do all of these things. But these are just letters, nobody's peer reviewed any of it. So my answer to all of these people has always been, if you dispute something that I find and that I write in my scientific papers, then what you must do is write to the journal with your own scientific paper.
Yes.
And then that gets peer reviewed, and then there's a proper scientific discussion about it, because of course I may not be right. I can make mistakes like anybody else, and there might have been some aspect of my research that I overlooked, or I might have got some equation wrong or whatever. I do an awful lot of work. It's entirely possible that I'm not perfect. But then the way to do it is not to attack me personally, but to actually discuss the research itself and say, well, look, excuse me, but you say this and you say that, but what about the other? And I would say, if that's the case, here you are. And the way this is done is through the medium of the journals. That's what science. That's how science works. It doesn't work by somebody saying, you're an idiot, I don't like you. That's not science. And also, I have to say, I've been in many, many court cases where I'm an expert witness, and we always win the case. So if you get into a proper arena with a proper judge, and a sort of controlled situation, then it doesn't cut any ice, as we say in England, to come along and say Chris Busby's a bad guy and he doesn't know how to do research, because you have to say why. You have to bring your evidence in. And I've been in court cases where people have attacked me personally, and the judge has said, well, thank you very much for your understanding of what Chris Busby is, but we're concerned with the research. We want to know what's happening here. Where is your research? And of course they never have any.
If we go back to Falluja, the US don't want to declare what weapons they used, and this weapon you are referring to that could exist as far as I know, would it be helpful if a widespread opinion around the world could get them to inform about these weapons?
I think I think that they will not bow to widespread public opinion. This is my own belief.
Yes.
I think that the only way that you will get these people is through in an international court or in a criminal court.
Okay.
And there are a number of platforms. There are a number of ways in which you can do this, but nobody has done it. So it can be done.
You think there exist possibilities to take it to court in some way, and
absolutely.
that it should be done?
Absolutely, there are and the way forward is through human rights legislation. There are a whole raft of laws in individual countries, protocols that have been signed up to by countries like Sweden, so-called civilized countries, relating to human rights and the environment.
Okay.
And this is enshrined in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and there are international courts, and there is a European Court of Human Rights, and there is there are two European courts that you can use. So this is the way that it could be done. And in fact, it doesn't really cost a lot of money, because these international courts are open in principle to ordinary human beings, what they call non-state actors. So anybody can go along there. Of course, you have to spend a bit of time, and you have to read the law, and you have to write it all, and so forth. You know, so it's a bit tedious. You need a
lawyer to defend.
A lawyer is best. But my experience is that lawyers are not very good, because they don't want to lose. You see, just as the scientists don't want to lose their job, the lawyer doesn't want to lose his job either. And if the lawyer starts to take a court case against somebody as big as the United States, you know, then they're liable to get into trouble.
Yes. We've also heard that the US and their studies in Iraq, they don't want statistics to be made on the children or illnesses and so on. So they don't like it to talk about the affected children. So how do you manage to get statistics and such things when it's not easy in Iraq?
It's not just Iraq, I can tell you, Sigyn. It's also in Sweden or in anywhere else. I mean, I have been interested in looking at the health effects of the Baltic Sea on people living close to the Baltic Sea, and the Swedish Cancer Registry will not give us the information. They refuse. And also the same in Helsinki, in Finland. The Finnish Cancer Registry refuses to give us data down to small areas that will enable us to investigate that issue. All over the world at the moment, cancer registries are controlled to not produce data that will enable independent scientists to look at situations where there is contamination. As far as Iraq is concerned, in Falluja, when we went around this and started knocking on doors and asking questions, how many people are there, who had cancer, and so forth, the television program came out and said that we were terrorists, and that anybody who answered these questions would be arrested as helping terrorists. And in fact, some of our people were beaten up. You know, how we managed as we managed, and some very brave people went out there, and they decided that it was more important to find the data than it was to be concerned about being beaten up or arrested or so forth. You know? And that's how we did it.
Yes, that's good. I would also like to hear a little about how you managed to fund all this research, because I mean, you don't get very much help, and
yes. Well, I have always done research for when it's important, for very little money or no money, and in this case it was no money. So first of all, most of us weren't paid. We didn't have any money at all. All we needed was money to pay some of the troops in Iraq, the guys who went around knocking on doors, and we had to buy them mobile phones so they could communicate with each other. We had to buy a generator for them so that they could run the photocopying machine, because half the time the electricity was switched off. So that's where that money went. And of course, mainly we had to find money to pay for these analytical measurements. So now the first study, which was the epidemiological study, didn't cost very much money at all. And we were given little bits of money by individuals. So one Arab guy would give us 500 euros, and then somebody else would give us 1,000 euros.
Yeah, we have also contributed.
And yes, of course, you have contributed. And Malak originally put her hand in her pocket herself, and she paid for it
Yeah.
herself.
Yes,
you know?
that's true.
So that's how we do it. I work for nothing. So that's how it works. That's how it works. And as far as the measurements are concerned, I think yes, you paid for a significant. And I managed to talk this lady who runs the laboratory in Germany into doing it very cheaply.
Yeah, okay.
You know? So we scratch along. That's how we do it. Yeah.
That's good, because research must go on about these children. Do you regard it as reasonable and probable that US should be required to pay compensation for what they have done?
Of course.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good.
And in fact, they should be taken. There is a mechanism called the Alien Torts. What's it called? Claims Act. The Alien Torts Claims Act, which is an American law which enables anybody to take a case against them. And somebody should do this. But the problem is nobody has. Nobody has. There are plenty of arenas where you can try and get some sort of redress in this area. But one of the problems has always been that there's no evidence. But now that I've done these studies, there is evidence. So we could go into court, and I would go into court as an expert witness. And if it was an unbiased court, I think we would win the case. I do believe so.
Yeah. That sounds interesting. And how do you suggest that we can help bring about widespread support for independent international research on this issue?
Well, frankly, I think there already is widespread support for international independent research on this issue. But the problem is that when people talk about independent research they say we must take it to the UN or to the Human Rights Council or to the World Health Organization. They see these organizations in some way as being independent, whereas I can tell you they aren't. The United Nations Environment Programme, I know from measurements that we have made with split samples, are not independent. The WHO is not independent. No. I can go on and on about evidence that shows this is the case, but the WHO has an agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency to leave all this sort of research to the IAEA. So there's a whole area of concern about what is and what isn't independent. And I have to say there are very, very few independent researchers. And the reason is that nobody pays them. So the reason I'm an independent researcher and I can afford to do what I do is that I actually don't care about money, you know. So long as I have enough money to survive, because I'm an old hippie, you know, I come from the time when it was all peace and love and all that stuff, and I managed to keep going like that on that sort of level of understanding, because to my mind, life is about the real things. You know, it's not about like having a good car or having lots of money or any of that stuff. It's about searching for the truth and trying to find it out and trying to help people that need help. So there are not many people like that. I can tell you, not many.
Oh, that is hard to hear, but because when you see these children, it breaks your heart. So we have to
it does. Well, that's why I do it.
Independent scientist somewhere.
Here I am, you know.
Yes,
but
that's
the
good.
thing is that I'm not going to last forever.
No, so we need more of them. And finally, how can the US and its war allies who are responsible for these crimes be held accountable?
I come back to the International Criminal Courts and the International Courts on Human Rights and so forth. But I did go to Geneva. And I talked to the head of the Human Rights Council on this very issue when I did the first paper. And I said, what can be done? And he said, nothing. And I said, how is this possible?
Yes, I do wonder how is that possible.
Because, I mean, how can there be a Human Rights Council if you can't do anything about human rights? And I said, for example, what would you do if I came to you with a scientific paper published in the same journal that said that Hitler was killing Jews, and here's the number of Jews that Hitler had killed, and here are all the Jewish children that he had killed. There's a number, there they all are, statistically written down. What would you do? He said, I have got no mechanism for doing anything. All I could do is write to Mr. Hitler. All I could do is write to Mr. Hitler and say, dear Mr. Hitler, you have been accused of killing Jews. What do you have to say about this? And I said, and then what? And then he said, well, nothing, because Mr. Hitler could write back and say, I'm not going to respond to this. Go away. And that's the end of it. So the point is that all of these wonderful mechanisms that have been created by good people, these human rights mechanisms that have been created by people who want to make the world a better place, are powerless. Or if they're not powerless, the people who operate them are not prepared to operate them. They have no teeth. Nobody can do anything. At the end of the day, might is right.
Or they put some third world dictator in court, but not those who are responsible.
Well, of course, yes.
For
I mean, you can go right up into the courts.
Wars and
sure, but I have to
occupations
say,
in the world.
in my experience of the courts, what they do is they won't let you go into the court.
No.
So, in other words, they pay up. So I've done many court cases on these issues. Not uranium. Well, yeah, one of them was uranium. One of them was uranium. And what they did is when they know they're going to lose the case in court, they just write a big check and they say, okay, we settle out of court. Because they absolutely don't want it to go to court, because then it becomes somehow real.